Good morrow, nerds. It is I. In most tabletop RPG systems, game masters have absolute power. But is this a good thing? Does absolute power corrupt GMs absolutely? And is there anything you can do about it? That's what we'll be discussing in this week's video. And now, with my absolute power as GM, I'm going to command you all to click like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications, because I can. The first thing we need to discuss in any conversation about how much power GMs should have is what GMs are actually meant to do, what their powers are over. Starting from the very beginning of any campaign, GMs are responsible for things like choosing the game system, setting, and for recruiting the first batch of players. Before each session, they are responsible for preparing things like adventures, encounters, NPCs, maps, miniatures or token art, whatever you use. Anything else that needs to be done before a session. Once they're in the session, they're responsible for role-playing anyone who isn't a PC, for setting the difficulties and outcomes of various die rolls, and for adjudicating the rules whenever any rules question comes up. That's quite a lot that pretty much each and every GM is expected to do. But giving the GM all this power does have a purpose. Well, a number of purposes, which can really vary heavily from system to system and group to group. But let's go over a non-exhaustive list of the possibilities. First off, a GM can be expected to be a fair and neutral arbiter of the rules, someone who lays the cards out on the table without any fudging or secret trickery or bias for or against the players, to maximize player agency and ensure that all of the outcomes that happen are realistic and authentic. On the other hand, some people expect the GM to entertain the players, to make sure that everyone on the table is having fun, laughing, joking, and just feeling good in general. On the third hand, sometimes the GMs are expected to challenge the players, to make things difficult, to give them challenges that they feel like they need to overcome, to give them a sense of accomplishment when they succeed, and to give them a good old kick up the arse when they fail. Sometimes the GM is expected to weave a grand story that enraptures their players, and sometimes they're expected to take a step back and be the vehicle for players to tell their character story through. And what you'll notice is that almost all of these goals are in some way mutually contradictory. No one GM will achieve all of these in the same campaign. And some of them will achieve none of them because either they're failing horribly as a GM, or because they have some other goal in mind that I didn't even mention. The interesting thing is that regardless which of these goals a GM goes for, they still end up needing roughly the same set of powers, with only a few exceptions that we'll get to nearer the end of this video. So, we know what their powers are, we know why their powers are. Are there any limits? The first and most obvious limit is the rules. The GM, as the arbiter of the rules, is expected to follow them, and to be fair, most GMs do follow the rules instinctually. But the GM also has the power to change the rules through house rules, which can be done in consultation with the players, or can be changed arbitrarily on a whim despite player protestations. An interesting example of rules limiting the GM is the Doom mechanic from Conan 2D20, and I believe in other 2D20 games this is called Threat, but I've only played Conan, so that's the one I'm familiar with. Basically, as a GM you have a meta currency called Doom, with a number of points in it. You can then spend these points to make life harder for the players, by giving extra dice to NPCs, by adding environmental hazards like darkness or heavy storms, or by doing any number of other little tricks. I think the idea here is to do a sort of permissive parenting trick on GM mischief, where the designer's going, well, as long as you only screw all the players a little bit, and only when you have Doom, then it's okay, but don't go crazy. Don't go on a weekend-long player-crushing bender, okay? Please. We love you, we care about you, don't go too crazy. I think that's what they're trying to do. However, when I played Conan 2D20, I absolutely hated the Doom mechanic. This is a problem with Conan 2D20 in general, but it does also apply to Doom specifically. A lot of the rules are really poorly worded, and it can be ambiguous what does and does not apply for a Doom spend. For instance, the GM can spend Doom to increase the difficulty of the rolls that players have to make, but when GMs are also the ones who set the difficulty, why can't you just set the difficulty to what you want based on the situation? Now yes, you do have to spend Doom to inflict certain external hazards, like darkness penalties, or to activate traps, or to inflict fatigue on players and stuff like that. But one interesting case that I had with my players was when they were in their pirate ship, travelling down the coast, and they had to stop to pick up supplies in Stygia. And so I made them do a couple of rolls, and on all of those rolls, I gave them a 1 difficulty increase penalty because none of them could speak Stygian. Now, my players got mad at me for doing this without spending Doom, to which my attitude was, everyone in Stygia speaks Stygian, you guys don't, that is a you guys problem, not of the system problem. I'm not imposing an external thing on you, because you guys could have taken Stygian as a language, but you simply chose not to. As opposed to Darkness, which applies whether you wanted to or not. And while I did get my way in the end, because, I was a GM, my players certainly weren't too happy with me for that ruling. Maybe someone in the comment section who has played Conan 2D20 can give me a better idea of how to rule this in future. But yeah, that was an experience I had of the rules trying to limit me, and me saying, no, you don't get to do that. But moving along, the next source of limitation that a GM might have is the setting and genre. If you're playing a sci-fi game, most GMs would not throw dragons at their player characters, unless they're explicitly playing in a science fantasy setting like, say, Shadowrun. Likewise, in a world of pulpy power fantasy, it's generally considered gauche for GMs to make their players calculate progressive income tax. However, the limits of setting and genre in terms of what GMs can and can't do is very vague and ethereal, and is even more subject to overruling than the actual rules are. GMs can and do ignore and change elements of settings at any time, and when it comes to things like genre and tone, there are plenty of GMs who will run RPGs that are a completely different tone to the one that they actually want to be having at the table. If that is a normal thing, it shouldn't be, but it is. And the final factor that influences what a GM can and can't do is the consent of the players. The one thing that players can do to influence the rules is to push, prod, and encourage the GM to be more fair with them, by pointing out when the GM does something that is either mistaken or unfair. There's a player that I'm going to mention a couple of stories about later in this video, and all of these stories are pretty negative, because to be fair, that player has made a lot of mistakes. But what I will do now is say this. For all of his faults, that player is very good at calling me out of my bullshit, and I am actually genuinely grateful for that, because he has made me a fairer and more consistent GM. At the end of the day though, the effect that he has been able to have is only possible because I'm willing to listen to him. If I wanted to dig my heels in, I could, and there'll be nothing he could do about it. In a very strict sense, while the GM can overrule players, the players can just leave, and if all of them leave, you no longer have a campaign, and therefore, you're no longer a GM. Also, I don't know, can you guys hear the really loud rain outside? My point is that while this is really one of the only hard limits on the GM, it's also a very onerous limit to inflict. It requires the player to leave the campaign, and in extreme cases it requires all of the players to leave the campaign. Some players will just feel too awkward to leave, some won't believe their GM's misbehaviours are bad enough to warrant leaving, and even if they do leave, the GM can just find new players and keep on tracking. So while it can put a hard stop to a GM abusing you, it cannot stop GMs abusing someone else. And speaking of GMs abusing things, let's talk about what happens when GMs abuse their power. Because this does happen. And there really are any number of bad behaviours that can come from the frivolous exercise of GM power. From only remembering positive combat modifiers when NPCs are rolling, and only remembering negative modifiers when players are rolling, to good old-fashioned player favoritism, otherwise known as a GM's girlfriend. GMs can find themselves being just needlessly cruel, or forcing the players into some linear situation where they take the player's agency away. Sometimes the GMs will go in and arbitrarily change the rules. The one that really annoys me is when GMs rebalance the abilities of player characters just because it's winding them up rather than because it's an actual issue. Something that I have rage quit a West Marches server over before. And there's always a good old classic of an unfairly difficult combat that just grinds the players into the dirt. This is not an exhaustive list. There are plenty of YouTube videos about Game Master sins that you can watch right after you finish watching this one, so I will let those people handle this. The question that I want to answer is, why do GMs abuse power? The first and most simple answer is because they can. But some sort of moustache-twirling malevolence is a bit too simple for me in terms of why this sort of thing happens. On some level, GMs may not realize that they're doing it. My first example of GMs remembering combat bonuses for NPCs but only the penalties for PCs, that could just be a memory issue. It shouldn't be, but it could be. Likewise, a GM engaging in favoritism might just be doing it because he genuinely loves his girlfriend and he wants her to feel special. Again, sucks for the other players, but that's why they're doing it. The truth is, every GM who is engaged in some sort of toxic behaviour has had some sort of justification for doing it. It was probably a flimsy justification that you really shouldn't give too much weight, but it did exist. And if you find yourself dealing with one of these GMs, take a moment to hear them out, to at least understand the thinking of someone who has gone wrong in life. Some of them will be sadists, and some of them will be just misguided people trying to do the right thing and failing miserably. But regardless, the results are the same. But not everything the GM gets blamed for is their fault. And in a lot of those situations, the GM can still end up being blamed anyway. The GM is not responsible, for instance, for a player being late. That is on the player. The GM is only partially responsible for system rules or an adventure's details being rubbish. They're the one who picked it, but they weren't the one who wrote it. They do only get partial responsibility. When two players are having an argument, it can be up to the GM to break it up, but on some level, unless you're playing with literal children, the players are adults and they should be able to work things out themselves. Seth Skolkowski, who as I've said before is something of an inspiration for this channel, has an entire rant video about GMs being blamed for things that they don't deserve to be. And I highly suggest that you watch that video once you finish with this one. I'll even link it in the description. It's been a while since I've watched it, but the broad point is that there are some things that genuinely aren't the GM's fault, that they do get blamed for anyway. And I actually agree with him, at least in part. His point is that we should stop blaming GMs for these sorts of issues. And while I notionally agree, that is never ever going to happen. GMs are always going to take a lot of blame from their players, or from anyone else who happens to hear their stories. I have been blamed before for not banning players quickly enough from my games. This genuinely happened to me once. I've told this story before, but not this side of the story. I had a player in my last D&D campaign who liked to make some rather inappropriate suggestions. For the most part, these were innocuous, even if they were a bit annoying, but one session things came to a head. Up to this point, the PCs have been going off on their merry adventures accompanied by two NPC companions. However, over the course of these travels, the relations between the PCs and these NPCs have been getting worse and worse, until finally a fight broke out. One NPC was killed, and the other was taken prisoner and tied up. The player in question then proceeded to suggest that the PCs should sit on her to stop her from running away, and that if said they needed to get up to go to the bathroom, they should just urinate on her. I'm not joking, that was his actual suggestion. When I suggested to him that the suggestion might be inappropriate, he stood his ground. Not only did he stand his ground, he kept on repeating this suggestion, and whenever I tried to move on to another player, he would come back to it. I gave him one final warning, he stood his ground again, and I muted him in the voice call. I was only going to mute him for a few minutes until I could deal with the other players, and shift the scene over to a situation where the topic of urine hopefully wouldn't come up. Unfortunately, I forgot to unmute him, and I only realised this an hour later. I apologetically unmuted him, and we went on with the rest of the session, being a bit more subdued. The next day, as I often do after a rather difficult session, I asked some people in various Discord servers what they thought of what happened, and I was asked why I hadn't banned him yet, especially given that he did have a history of stupid disruptive requests. The answer that I gave them, that I do stand by to this day, is that 1, he was a dumb 19-year-old who needed to learn, and banning him would not be an effective lesson. And 2, because he actually had proven in the past that when bad behaviour was pointed out to him, he could change. The nice thing about dumb 19-year-olds is that they are quite malleable, and so they have a much easier time breaking bad habits than, say, a 39-year-old would. I did turn out to be right on this front. He did improve his behaviour, and he's still in my group to this day. But that didn't stop people blaming me for not banning him. But let's get back to the point at hand here. The truth is this. The price of authority is getting blamed. If you're the one who makes decisions, then you're the one who takes all the flack when those decisions go badly. To any DMs complaining about this, I want to ask you a simple question. In your day job, have you ever blamed your boss for something that realistically wasn't their fault? The truth is, this is something that everybody does, and it's something that is always going to happen. As GMs, you just need to accept it and learn to thicken your skin. That's really all you can do. But not every GM decision is actually made by the GM. Sometimes, game masters will collaborate with their players to come to some group consensus. In fact, in my early GM career, I used to do this quite a bit. The main place where GMs and players tend to collaborate is on world building and narrative elements. Things like naming towns or NPCs, and on describing actions or even coming up with story complications if you're of that sort of bent. In fact, there are even some game systems that actively encourage this. They're often termed narrativist or story games. Those are different concepts, but they are often conflated. And to be fair, both of them do kind of fit here. But even if you aren't playing a narrativist system, you can still do this. I've told this story before, this is literally the 3rd time now, but I had a Cyberpunk Red campaign that switched over to Savage Worlds, and when we did, our characters also moved over from Night City to Miami due to events in the story. Now when we did, the GM left basically all of the world building up to us, and if you want the full details on that, then go watch my video about why world building sucks. Again, once you finish this one. Bear in mind that both Cyberpunk Red and Savage Worlds are systems that don't particularly encourage a GM-player collaboration, but neither of them really prevent it in any way, which is why it happens so much in our campaign. But the truth that has to be given here is that players can't really collaborate with the GM more than the GM wants them to. As a player, you cannot force a GM to name an NPC a certain name, though that hasn't stopped my players from trying. You know that player from earlier, the pee on an NPC guy? Yeah, so before that, he got up to other antics with NPCs. What happened is that much earlier in the campaign, the PCs rescued a woman and a child from being sacrificed by cultists. No, the two of them weren't related. Now, the female NPC in this situation was named Esmeralda. However, the player either didn't hear that, or misheard me, or something happened, and he thought she was named Patricia. And I corrected him and said, no, she's named Esmeralda. No, I want her to be named Patricia. And we went back and forth. And all that happened here, the NPC started to canonically dislike the PC because of his antics, because some of them were actually in character, and so it was actually appropriate to have that be a consequence. And in the end, he did eventually relent after I chastised him out of character, and to be honest, the whole thing is a massive joke. And you know what? If he ever GMs for me, I will gladly go around calling all of his female NPCs Patricia just to wind him up. I know that I shouldn't, but it would be so funny. I'd like to take a moment here to point out that yes, there are some RPG systems that don't have GMs, and that in these systems, presumably, the question of GM absolute power doesn't come up. But the thing is, I've never played or even read a GM-less game. They are very niche, and so I genuinely can't tell you how they play out. But to tie this video up in a lovely little bow, I can say that yes, GMs do have absolute power for better and for worse. Because yes, absolute power can corrupt absolutely. Though, interestingly, not in all cases. There are some GMs who are genuinely responsible with their absolute power, and who do use their powers over the game world and the rules genuinely for the betterment of their players. If anything, the restraint and responsibility that some GMs are capable of showing is a genuine white pill for humanity's relationship with power. The hallmark, in my view, of a good responsible GM is not that the rules or the players are restricting what they can do. It's that they are restricting what they can do. They have self-imposed morals and ethics that guide what they do and don't do with the rules, and that's generally the most effective way that I've seen to prevent abuses of power. It's not 100%, it never will be. And in some ways, it's a bit too ethereal for my liking, but it's what we have, and it works. And we're all the better for it. Because while GMs can share power with their players, while players can call their GMs out on bad behavior and push them to be better, at the end of the day, you do need someone who can be the final arbiter of the rules. And that someone is going to end up being the GM. While you could split the GM role into the story person and the rules person, getting RPG groups together is bad enough without trying to find two GMs for them. So yeah. If you're a good GM, I applaud you. If you're a bad GM, I condemn you. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. What's your best experience of a good GM, or your worst experience of a bad GM? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. We are so close to 400 subscribers right now. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.